All right, welcome to episode 68 of Seize the Moment podcast. And today we have a very special guest. His name is Ian Olasov. He's an adjunct professor and doctoral candidate at the City University of New York Graduate Center. His writing has appeared in Slate, Vox, Public Seminar, amongst others. He won the American Philosophical Association's Public Philosophy Op-Ed Prize in 2016 and 2018. He runs the Ask Philosopher booth in locations around New York City and lives in Brooklyn, New York. His new book that just came out is called Ask a Philosopher, Answers to Your Most Important and Most Unexpected Questions. Welcome, Ian.
Hey, thank you so much for having me. This should be fun.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming on. And so just to dive into it, I mean, the thing that sort of sparked my interest the most was the Philosopher booth. So can you tell us a little bit about sort of the history of it, kind of how it was manifested or how it came to fruition? And then also, how did you sort of come up with the idea for it? And how did you, I guess most importantly, how did you see it as a need that needed to be filled?
Sure. So I got the idea from a talk given by the, sorry, there's a fire.
It's okay.
Hold on. Okay.
It's okay. We can wait.
I live about 20 feet from Flatbush Avenue, which is like main drag in Brooklyn. A lot of ambulances. Okay. Yeah. I got the idea for the Ask a Philosopher booth from a talk given by the philosopher Lynn Terrell. She was reporting on a similar project that the philosopher Lawrence Blum had undertaken in Boston. Now, I misunderstood what the project actually was. I thought she was describing basically the Ask a Philosopher booth, but it turned out that what Blum did was he had, as a kind of capstone project for a philosophy class for like middle schoolers and teenagers, they would like go out onto the Boston Commons and like talk with people about their philosophical questions. So I thought they were talking about something similar happening with adults, but so I took that idea and ran with it. I mean, that's kind of the causal story of how this came about. I mean, the rationale for it is a different one. I had been organizing a public philosophy speaker series for a few years before that, which is still ongoing at the Brooklyn Public Library. And the speaker series is great, and it's nice to give people an opportunity to, learn about what philosophers are up to, learn about the problems that preoccupy them. But it's the philosophers themselves at a public lecture who are determining the course of the conversation, who are setting the agenda. And I thought it would be nice and valuable to have, ordinary people setting the agenda. So there are, the questions that people, are walking around with all the time that this ideas and techniques from the, philosophical tradition can help address. So yeah, so we set up this booth. The first one was at Grand Array Plaza in Brooklyn, across the street from the central branch of the library. And, a bunch of people came by and talked to us, and we've done it a bunch of times since then. Yeah, like a handful of professors and graduate students will sit around, got like a little bowl of philosophical questions written out on pieces of paper, and a bowl of thought experiments, and a bowl of candy. And, so if people don't sort of have a question ready to hand, which, they usually don't, why would you? Those can sort of start a conversation, and then usually the conversations will sort of branch off from there.
What kind of questions do people come to you with, or to the other speakers with? Yeah,
I thought when we started this that people were primarily going to ask about questions which sort of come up inevitably in the course of like city life. That people would ask questions about gentrification, that they would ask questions about work in the city, that they would ask the sort of everyday sort of moral problems that they've encountered, and so on. And people do ask those things. And people want to talk about Trump. People want to talk about the sort of state of, political discourse in the city or in the United States. but just as often, and maybe a little bit more often, they want to talk about questions, problems, topics, which are sort of totally removed from the kind of grind of city life. So people have asked, why does the world exist? Why is there anything at all? A lot of questions about the nature of mathematical knowledge. Multiple people have come by to ask us, how can we know anything? How can we know mathematical truths since you can't literally see numbers or mathematical functions? How do we communicate through dance? Does God exist? The meaning of life? These just like questions which are I think sometimes it's surprising that they matter to people, but in any case, they're questions which sort of remove you from city life or from your immediate surroundings or something for a moment. Yeah. So it's an enormous range. The answer is they ask us everything. Yeah.
Yeah, I could see meaning being a big issue to bring up, especially living in the city, right? I mean, we're surrounded by so much stimuli all the time, right? We're always on our phones. If let's say, especially in New York, you're on the train, there's not a lot of that eye contact going on. Rarely, if it does, but otherwise everyone's usually on their phone, listening to music, maybe to an audiobook, reading something, depends, right? And I could see, if there are so many people, and I forgot what's it called, 150, the Dunbar number, right, where you were supposed to be living in groups of 50,
150, it's 150, it's 150.
Yeah, yeah, and if we're surrounded by so many people, it's hard to have that sort of community feeling and vibe, so to speak. So I mean, meaning can definitely be a big issue, especially living in the city, because you try to find your own people or community to be around.
Right.
Yeah.
And how does, I guess, one answer that question for different people? So it's like, I mean, they obviously come to you with the blanket question of like, what's the meaning of life? What would you say?
Well, I have an answer to this question, which we get asked about the meaning of life, I think probably more often than anything else, because it's, I think for a lot of people, a kind of paradigm case of a philosophical question. Yeah, for the record, my view is that it doesn't matter. So that people are interested in the meaning of life, or discovering what the meaning of life would be, or perhaps discovering what a meaningful life would look like, because they think that would give them some kind of practical guidance or sort of emotional reassurance. But, to take a silly example, suppose that you were to discover that human beings didn't evolve from our primate ancestors, that we were genetically engineered and put here by a race of alien livestock farmers. And the idea is that they would let us, procreate and, conquer the world and so on. And, in 1,000,000 years or 10,000 years or whatever, they'd come back and harvest us. And so if this were the case, it's not, but if this were the case, there would be a very clear meaning to human life in general and to your life in particular, which you were intended to feed these aliens. But of course, if you were to discover this, you wouldn't think, oh, thank God, now I know my place in the world. I know what I have to do with my life. I have to eat as much as possible and have as many children as possible so I can, feed my alien overlords. I mean, which all of this is to say that even if there were a meaning to life, it wouldn't have the practical and kind of affective upshot that people are looking for. And so then the question is, well, what would, what are people really looking for when they're looking for meaning? What would have that kind of practical significance? And it depends. I think it depends on the context in which they're raising the question. If it's coming out of some sort of feeling of, rootlessness or alienation or just sort of uncertainty about your life plan, well, what would give you that sense of rootedness or belonging, or, some reassurance that your life is on the right track.
Mm-hmm.
Different things for different people, but, you could look at, psychological research on, what careers people are satisfied with. You could, ask yourself sort of what groups of people sort of are, have by some empirical measure or other sort of better feelings of belonging or something like that. So, I think there are ways of addressing the practical and emotional demands which give rise to the question, but the way you address those demands is not by identifying the meaning of life. So that's a long answer. That's a long answer to a short question, but yeah.
Yeah. So do you really think that when people are asking about the meaning of life, that what they're actually asking about is how do I sort of foster well-being?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think or sometimes it's about your personal well-being. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it's about leading a moral life or an impactful life. And sometimes it's about a sort of particular flavor of well-being, a feeling of, there are different ways to do well. I think if people if there's a concern about your own well-being that you express in terms of the meaning of life, it's sort of like a concern about, it's a concern about belonging, a concern about having a sort of plan that you can fully endorse. And so, that's a particular sort of constituent or variety of well-being. But yeah, I think that's right.
Yes, essentially what they're asking is, what meaning does my own life have? Or what meaning can I create or foster in my own life, right? I can definitely identify with that, right? I mean, especially when you're trying to search for the meaning of life. I mean, essentially, if let's say you don't end up finding that answer, or let's say you come to the answer that maybe there's no clearly definable objective meaning, right? Then essentially the meaning that you would give to life is what would determine what you get out of life, right?
And then, Ian, would you say, philosophically speaking, what we're actually asking, so let's say if we're connecting meaning to well-being, kind of our own or external well-being, or some combination of the two, well, we say then, well, philosophy can answer that question by just looking around. So empirically, we could say, when it comes to well-being, sort of this is what kind of usually helps people, and this is what usually harms them. So let's say, I don't know, I mean, maybe that's too black and white, but maybe the idea is like, well, here's like the normal sort of way that people, or not the normal, let's say in our culture, this is the usual way that people find meaning, right? They try to go through this sort of the avenue of status and wealth, sort of prestige, talent or whatever. And kind of like, for the most part, we can say objectively, this is a lot of times how it pans out. But then at the other end, when let's say people focus more on their relationships, their friends, their family, they focus on being important within their communities, right? Within those maybe 150 people that they're around. That's what actually leads to kind of long-term sustained meaning. It's like, because fame and kind of status and prestige is so sort of fickle, you can enjoy it for some time, but then maybe you'll even feel lonely, and then eventually you'll lose it anyway. But whereas sort of this other path, maybe again, empirically or philosophically speaking, this is what kind of philosophy shows is what leads to kind of overall well-being.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I think it's a really tricky problem, and I don't have a solution to it. Sort of what role there is for social science, and what role there is for the tools of philosophy in working out, what well-being is, what it is for someone's life to go well for them. The philosopher Dan Hebron has some interesting stuff about this. There's, a lot of empirical studies of what's called well-being are studies of sort of surveys of that are supposed to indicate how satisfied people are with their own lives. So you answer a bunch of questions, about, roughly about how satisfied you are with your life. And if you think about this is a very weird thing to ask people about. like if you, I don't have the surveys on hand, obviously, but like, if you just ask yourself, like, yeah, how satisfied I am with my life. I mean, what the fuck are you supposed to do with that, right? Like, satisfied with my life as opposed to what? As opposed to being dead right now? Well, yeah, I'm glad I'm not dead. Satisfied with my life as opposed to, somebody else's life. Well, okay, I know a little bit about other people's lives, but not that much. It's hard to make that kind of comparison. The sort of empirical study of well-being ends up being the study of life satisfaction, but life satisfaction is just a very bizarre construct. And so, so there's philosophical work to do there, which is like, okay, well, what would be, if this survey isn't measuring what we want it to measure, then what would be a survey that measures what we want it to measure? That's a little suggestive about sort of what role there is for philosophy and what role there is for, psychology and sociology, behavioral economics, whatever, in just describing what a good life is for a person, what it means for someone's life to go well for them.
And I can actually envision philosophy being significant here because, so I can't imagine, honestly, I could be wrong, but I can't imagine a social scientist pretty much creating the argument that you just did, saying, well, life satisfaction isn't necessarily a good thing, or is it? Or what are we even really comparing it to? So why I think philosophy in this domain is so important is because we could look at the data and we could sort of foster or kind of create a hypothesis around what it says. So if, let's say, the data says, here are these people who are, let's say, and I know we're going to get into this a little bit later, but mental health wise, let's say you have a psychotic disorder and you find life to be incredibly satisfying, right? But you're incredibly detached from reality. Would we actually say that that person is happy, or would we say that they're delusional? Or are they both? Can you be delusional and happy at the same time? Is it okay for them to be delusional and happy at the same time? So why philosophy here is so important is because it sort of takes and I see this a lot, and look, I'm not a scientist, but I see it a lot in data or in research where people kind of have these blanket terms like life satisfaction. And it sounds or it seems nice on the surface, but I think philosophy creates a level of nuance that not necessarily doesn't really exist in science because okay, maybe that's not fair. But let's say I don't think it exists to the degree it does in philosophy and science, because I think often in science, they're very quick to sort of point out data, right? That's the thing that matters more than anything. It's not so much of like how useful is this data, although it still is, but it's more about what does the data tell us. Whereas philosophically speaking, we're saying that, okay, this is what the data tells us, but then how do we interpret the data? What do we do with that data? So again, going back to a particular, let's say, psychotic episode, yes, this person meets all of the criteria for life satisfaction. And even though the data is telling us that, the construct applies to this human being, does that actually necessarily mean that this construct in this case equals something good or something positive for their life? So pretty much what I'm saying is that when it comes to philosophy, I think philosophy more than anything, and just it's tying into the theme of public philosophy in general, why I think philosophy is so important is because it brings in a level of nuance that we don't often see in everyday life, and a level of nuance that I think we don't even often see in psychology or in social science as a whole, because I think we're so kind of zeroed in on the answers that we're looking for, again, like life satisfaction, that we often fail to see the bigger picture of what do those answers tell us and how important are they.
Yeah.
Right. Well,
I think. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Oh well. Okay. So a couple of thoughts. Yeah. There's an interesting kind of philosophy of science, sort of methodological question for how psychologists and behavioral economists, et cetera, sort of come up with the concepts or measures which they use to kind of approximate our sort of everyday or authentic or whatever concept of well-being. And you can think of if you look at the sort of specific ways that they measure test retest reliability or construct validity in one or another sort of one or another methodological standard for sort of proving that some concept is sort of worth pursuing. There are ways of poking holes in these practices, or there are ways of raising questions about whether something that is valid and reliable in the social scientific sense also necessarily measures something that we actually give a shit about. I think I'll add one other thing, which is that there are lots of ways of describing the value of public philosophy, and there are different sort of values that attach to different public philosophy projects, and this is something we could talk about. But when you raised the point about meaning earlier, yeah, in a sense, it's not surprising that people raise the question of the meaning of life, because in some sense they're starved for meaning by, you know, our everyday experiences of, you know, being stuck at work, or, you know, being glued to our phones, or whatever it is. But one way of kind of getting meaning out of philosophical exchange is to talk about it directly. Another way of kind of getting meaning is to get the kind of intimacy or connection, which just comes from talking about philosophy productively, period. So you could get the kind of, if what you're looking for is a sort of a human connection in which you feel like your ideas are being valued, and that you're meeting with somebody else to reason about what you care about, and, you know, you're sort of treating each other as peers. You know, we don't get that a lot. And so, you know, you could be talking about why the world exists. You could be talking about mathematical knowledge, but you're still getting this kind of intimacy, which you're not going to get at, you know, in a conversation with your boss or something, or, just sort of awash in the, you know, information overload you're getting from your phone or whatever. So that kind, in a sense, this sort of meaning that people might be seeking by talking about the meaning of life, you can get by just sort of having any, you know, successful philosophical conversation where you feel like you're being treated seriously.
Wow. And that's sort of very similar to psychotherapy. So sometimes people think that, let's say if you're going to a therapist for, you know, whatever mental health issue, that the therapist is supposed to be this kind of all-knowing person, sort of like a doctor, right? They're going to tell you exactly what's wrong. They're going to give you a diagnosis, and then they're going to give you a prescription. Even if it's just talk therapy, the idea is they're going to sort of give you the blueprint of what to do. You have depression, right? You have depression for these reasons, A, B, and C, right? So if you do this, A, B, and C, your depression is going to be sort of lifted, or it's going to subside. And so what I actually find in my own practice as a therapist is that it's very philosophical in the sense of, a lot of times I don't have the answers. And a lot of times what I find that works is when two people are, it's this collaboration between two people, and they're looking for the answers together. Where one person says, hey, I have this like information. And then the other person says, well, I have this information, right? So whereas I may come from a more sort of, let's say not necessarily academic, but a more sort of specifically academic perspective from psychology. And, you know, my client may know some other things, and they would say, well, you know, I have my life experiences, and then I have like other things that I've learned in school, or other things that were important to me. And you kind of put those two together, and you end up sort of learning from one another. And that, I think, is very sort of philosophical, because I assume that's most of the time what philosophers do. You have sort of different people within even interdisciplines. Even interdisciplinary. But then you also have people, you know, kind of within different disciplines of philosophy, and they come together and they say, hey, dude, like I have this information, and maybe you have that information, and let's kind of try to work it out together. And for me, it's like the answers, and this is what I'm sort of getting from you, Ian, with the booth, is that the answers aren't so important, but what's important is that the other person is not only treated with respect, but that the other person kind of knows like, oh, it's actually okay that I don't have the answers. But what I have to do is exactly what these guys are doing. I have to kind of go look for them.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think that in a lot of contexts, yeah, the most important thing people might take away from the booth isn't the particular answer that we've offered to the question. It could be, you know, just that the question is taken seriously, you know, that you're not a, you know, weirdo, or that you shouldn't be, you know, ashamed for caring about this. You know, hopefully sometimes, you know, the sort of, you know, the discussion of some problem in philosophy has gone somewhere. You know, we've made some sort of progress, and, you know, that, you know, by, you know, sharing whatever idea or tool from philosophy with, you know, a visitor to the booth, you know, they can make progress on this question too, whatever that looks like exactly. I mean, I think the connection between philosophy and therapy here is really, really interesting. I think it's really actually kind of heartening and great to hear your description of the, you know, way that you approach the problems that your, patients, clients come to you with, that it's like a kind of collaborative sort of pooling of knowledge and ideas to take a problem seriously. I think that often I haven't been in talk therapy in a long time, but when I was, when I was a teenager, and it's been a few years, but when I was in talk therapy, I think one of the experiences I had was that like my, whatever was troubling me, whatever anxiety I had, was fixated on, often enough at least, an actual philosophical problem. Conversation would unfold therapeutically wasn't like, well, how can we solve this problem? It was like, where did this problem come from? What happened in your life to give rise to this problem? And, that's a question that's worth asking sometimes, but it's a distraction from the problem. It's not going to answer the problem. It's like, if you find out that, you felt like you weren't listened to as a young child or something like that, and that's why you have this problem. Well, okay, that's interesting, but it's not going to solve the problem for you. So I think that's one thing that it sounds like your sort of practice, but also the practice of the booth, to some extent, or for some people, can do, is that it can take people's problems and not try to diagnose them or sort of give some sort of causal story about how they came about, which people can somehow help people cope in one way or another. But it's to address the problem head on and say, well, if this is what you're anxious about, let's talk about it rather than talk about where it came from. Yeah,
that makes sense, right? I forgot what the saying is, but yeah, if let's say you were shot with an arrow, you don't want to know, and it hits you. You're not interested in the origin of the arrow, where did it come from, what's it made out of, all of that. You're interested in getting that arrow removed and solving the problem.
That's gorgeous. That's a great analogy. I like that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good anecdote. Who was it? That was Massimo who said that, right? I think that was a Stoic. I think that may have been
actually, I read it in The Power of Now.
Oh, that was Eckhart Tolle?
Eckhart Tolle probably quoted somebody, probably Buddha or something like that. I just don't remember very clearly.
Okay, I'm gonna have to Google that. That's good.
Yeah. And it's like, and a lot of what we do in therapy is actually, at least in my perspective, very philosophical. So, there are definitely, even I would say like the more sort of, whatever, I don't want to use this term, I guess, too rigidly, even though the term is rigid. So it's not, there are like these rigid sort of psychotherapies, like let's say CBT and kind of ACT, but the idea is that they're also very sort of collaborative and philosophical. So what you're doing is you're essentially, like, CBT is based on Stoicism. So the idea is pretty much your interpretation is what's causing you suffering. So, it's talking about the origin, but then it's also kind of, on the other hand, working on the issue at hand as well, which are your interpretations. And so the interesting thing is, unfortunately, where most kind of therapists falter is where they actually already have an interpretation in mind as they're trying to help the person reframe their interpretation. So it would be akin to, let's say Alan, met me in the Philosopher's booth, and he was like, "Hey, Leon, like, what's the meaning of life?" I'm like, "Oh, thank God, I have all of these answers for you. I'm going to give you this whole sort of doctrine," right? So it would be akin to that, because I'm sure he'd be pretty pissed off, and he'd be like, who is this guy? Like, how the hell does he know what the meaning of life is? So a lot of times when people come to therapy, the understanding is that, the therapist sort of knows better. So I'm going to come with my terrible interpretations. The wise therapist is going to give me his sort of enlightened interpretations, and I'm going to come out and I'm going to be significantly less depressed. So unfortunately, that most of the time that sort of therapy goes nowhere. So because we're people, and I think for a lot of therapists, because they're afraid of like not looking like experts, they kind of already know, or they think they know, I know what the interpretations are, right? I'm going to sort of bestow kind of my intellect on you, and I'm going to teach you how you should be thinking about the world. Where really the best form of therapy is actually when it's kind of like where there's sort of a pretty much a substantial level of uncertainty, where a person may give you an interpretation and you don't automatically jump in and say, no, you're not, that's not how the world is, you're not seeing it correctly. Where you would have to actually explore that interpretation with them to actually see where it is. So kind of like what we talk about are sort of levels of truth. So is the interpretation 20% true? Is it 30%, 40, 50, 100, or whatever? But the point is, you have to be willing to stay with that uncertainty, because who knows, maybe you're wrong. Maybe your interpretation is is false. And by the way, I find myself making these mistakes, like, unfortunately, a lot of the time, where I'm like, oh no, I know that this person's life or world or whatever can't be this way. And sometimes I'm proven wrong, and it just, I guess it is what it is. But the point is, from the therapeutic perspective, I think a lot of times, like, and we get this from philosophy, because, and I want to give it credit, this is founded in philosophy. You're sort of coming to the situation, you may have an answer in mind, and that's okay, by the way. It's the problem is when people are married to the answers. So the problem is when a person kind of gives you, let's say, contradicting data, and you're like, no, that doesn't kind of fit with what the reality is. There's something off there. I'm not even going to seriously consider it. And I'm assuming that's a lot of times what you got at the booth, sort of these dialogues where the both of you are kind of coming to these truths together, and that essentially what you're doing is you're saying to one another, okay, I have these sort of, these maybe ideologies or these perspectives, but I'm willing to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think there have been, a lot of occasions where some encounter at the booth has like substantively changed my mind about whatever the subject is. I just to take one example, I think I wrote about this briefly in the book. I was talking with an artist who came by about intellectual property. I forget how we got onto the subject of intellectual property, but I have my general view is that just the system of copyrights and trademarks and patents is just completely broken, and the underlying kind of philosophical rationale in terms of property rights attending people's acts of creation is probably incoherent, and said something sort of sweeping along those lines. And then this artist was like, fun fact, like she actually patents a lot of her work, and which is it would be one thing for her to copyright them, but for some reason she thought that the patenting would work because it would, at least in principle, if somebody else ended up using, so she would, if she came up with a new technique for some type of screen printing or something like that, or just like came up with a new series of works, which just all some sort of central theme that she was elaborating. Mm-hmm. The thought was that, well, in the future, if she ever wanted to, she could trot this out into the world. If somebody else came up with the same idea, she could say, here, I got here first. But she wasn't actually interested in enforcing the patents. I mean, both because it would be sort of, legally a headache, but also because like, she's not interested in telling people what they can or can't do artistically. Mm-hmm. What she really wanted, it seemed to me, was just a kind of recognition for her originality, and she wanted some sort of seal of approval from other people that was like, this, like, I did this, and that's, I think, a really like that my kind of glib or sweeping view of intellectual property. I didn't completely change it. I still think that copyright and patents are for the most part broken in the United States, but I did take on this sort of more sympathetic view of like, well, part of what people are looking for in this system is like a totally legitimate and real thing, which is that they're looking for recognition. They're not necessarily looking to like dominate other people who come up with similar ideas or something like that. They just want, they want some acknowledgement from the world, which of course they do, because everybody does. So it's like this little interaction is just like so surprising to me. Yeah, so and that interaction wouldn't have worked, obviously, if I'd let this person tell this story about her experience with patent and said, no, you're wrong, that's not how patents work. Like that wouldn't have been a productive exchange. I had to have a sort of open mind in the way that you're describing. It had to be a collaborative thing.
Yeah. And it also seems to me, I mean, you don't necessarily have to be even a therapist or a psychologist to be able to do this. I mean, this is stuff that Alan and I talk about all the time. And Alan, who like has no, I guess, official training in any of this, I mean, he's as great of a therapist, I think, as I am. So it's like he has this platform that he created called Ego and Zell. And so what it does is, I don't want to speak too much for you, but
I actually thought you were going to use the example. So somebody also has another podcast also.
Oh, that one? Yeah.
Podcast.
Uh-huh.
and that came out like a month or so
Like,
ago.
yeah, a month or two ago.
And then we were thinking, okay, wait, should we patent the show then? You know, like, I mean, it's not like I mean, I can't speak to how they're doing right now, but from what I saw, it looked like, you know, they're doing their own thing. They're not necessarily, they're doing something a little different from us, but it does make you interested in maybe considering patenting it. So maybe if something happens in the future, you don't necessarily want somebody to be making money off of your name or whatever.
Right, or the naming rights, yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
I mean,
or that yeah, right. If somebody ends up using sort of, you know, ideas which you know, sort of are regard as like very important to you, that it's important that people not misinterpret them, then yeah, you know, you'd want to be able to stake some sort of claim if people started abusing those ideas in some way or other. But yeah, sure.
Yeah, but at the same time, I also don't know if we should necessarily patent it. Or yeah, I mean, it's up for debate as far as that goes. I mean, what if I understood correctly, what is it that you see is wrong with copywriting or patenting exactly? If I'm not asking that incorrectly.
no,
Yeah.
it's a good question.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, well, I mean, I think that medical patents are certainly one sort of very, very clear example of this. So, you know, insulin has, but people keep renewing the patents by coming up with, you know, new ways of delivering the drug.
Technical.
It's just a way of like of scamming people for money. Oh wait, sorry, my internet is going in and out. Are you okay? Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, we didn't hear
It's good.
Wait, yeah, we didn't hear the last thing you said.
Okay, yeah. Should I let me start that point over then?
Yeah, about patenting. Yeah, medical patents.
Yeah. So I think medical patents are a pretty clear case here. So, you know, insulin has existed. The basic insight, the basic discovery was made, you know, 100 or however many years ago, you know, but pharmaceutical companies keep renewing these patents by sort of making these, you know, goofy, not especially, you know, innovative tweaks to the method for delivering insulin. And, you know, the upshot is that, you know, they can't afford this drug, which by all rights should be very, very cheap. There's a whole sort of cottage industry of trying to patent things that already exist and have existed for a really long time. People trying to patent, you know, the toaster in like 2020.
Oh my God.
It's like with the thought that like, well, they know it's bullshit. Everybody knows it's bullshit, but like you can, but 1 in 100 of these patents will actually be approved, and then you can make a killing doing absolutely nothing.
Yeah.
Patent against all of the toaster manufacturers. So, you know.
Yeah, that's really wild.
That
So,
makes sense.
I mean, I guess my opinion would be on that. I mean, not to, I guess, too much to go into it, but my thinking is like something should be patented and something should not. So if like we agree that there's a particular, let's say medicine, right? Let's say if medicine obviously is for the greater good, then maybe that's something that we could kind of lay off. But then when it comes to like, I don't know, podcast naming rights or like novel rights or movie rights or whatever. I mean, if like that's your intellectual property, and I mean, it's really mostly made for entertainment or whatever. It's not, let's say, it's not absolutely useful knowledge or not absolutely necessary knowledge. And maybe like that stuff that we can obviously patent. But the idea is there has to be some sort of balance, I think.
Yeah, I think the, you know, the underlying for, you know, copyrights, which are sort of more relevant to, you know, creative works, you know, written works, songs, podcasts, that kind of thing. You know, the justification for it, I think, is that, you know, people need a financial incentive to do this stuff. And well, one thing to say there is that, well, not everybody, you know, some people are willing to do podcasts for write music and stories and whatever for free.
Mm-hmm.
But another thing to say is that, like, well, there are ways of funding the arts, for example, that don't involve people having some monopoly on the sale of some artistic good or service, which is granted by a copyright. So, we could have, so instead of having, for example, painters, copyright their paintings and then selling them and making sure that nobody ever makes a reproduction, we could have more public grants for painters. So, they could continue to do their work and they wouldn't have to sell it privately. Maybe, for example, this would have the consequence of having people do more public art rather than selling art in galleries so it can, sit in somebody's home and only a handful of people can enjoy it, So I think there are other ways of it. So I think the kind of the whole, that's not always going to work. I think you're right that, like, yeah, there has to be some kind of balance here. But I think in reasoning about this sort of law of intellectual property, it would help a lot if we were more open-minded about ways of funding the activities that the whole system of intellectual property is intended to fund, Yeah.
Okay, and then so kind of going back to some of the other questions. So outside of sort of meaning and God, I wonder, do people ask you kind of more personal questions, or do they ask you questions kind of like about specific situations where they feel like they need guidance?
Yeah, they do. And, philosophers aren't necessarily in any better position than anybody else to answer them. Although, you might be able to sort of articulate whatever the central dilemma is or whatever the, values are that are in tension. But, philosophers are just as, fucked up and dysfunctional as everybody else. But, but yeah, we've gotten questions about, I'll take one example. So somebody came to the booth and they had a friend who had an adult daughter who had serious mental health problems and had gotten pregnant, I think, with her second kid. So she had one kid that was already born and had just become pregnant with the second kid. And the first kid was already, so to be clear, it's a somewhat difficult situation to describe. So the person who's talking to me is friends with a person whose daughter has mental health problems. The daughter becomes pregnant for the second time. And so there's this whole sort of tangle of moral and the daughter's first child, was already being taken care of by her grandmother. Right. And so there's this sort of tangle of questions here, which is mostly revolve around sort of what it means to be a good friend and when it makes sense to interfere with people's personal decision making in ways that you ordinarily wouldn't. So so would the grandmother, for example, have any way of convincing her daughter to get an abortion? Would the person who came to me, who's sort of standing outside of this situation but is sympathetic and cares about the people involved, what can you possibly do? If you're sitting as a friend to a person who's in this kind of awful family drama, you feel like you want to help, but then but that's how families work. They sort of have to solve their own problems internally, at least to some extent. That's just sort of what families are. And so, what can you do as a friend to, help out your friend, help out your friend's kid, and so on, without feeling like you're overstepping some bounds or violating, the sanctity of this family in some way or other. And, I think. God, this conversation was like 3 years ago, so I can't remember exactly how it unfolded. But
Sure.
that was about as personal as a conversation can get. But there's work for philosophers to do there. Like I said a moment ago, the work is identifying the values that are at stake and what makes this difficult, a difficult decision for all the parties involved, or a difficult sort of set of decisions. Right. And then, once you've got the values that are in play, then you can ask yourself, what's the basis for these values? Is this a sort of special case where the basis for, why we care, for example, about being a good friend sort of runs out, in this particular instance, or why we care about somebody's autonomy runs out in this particular instance. So, so we've had conversations like that, a lot of conversations about sort of workplace difficulties. There was one, I'm remembering one conversation which I remember really enjoying, but now the details are escaping me. Anyway, that one example was a trip. I just felt really sorry for the person I was talking to, but hopefully we were able to just sort of iron things out a little bit, or help her find some clarity which she hadn't had before.
Yeah, and
yeah, no, I really like that, because it is a moral dilemma that that person's experiencing, mm-hmm. and you're weighing, okay, an abortion, which is already morally questionable, right? You want to kill a child, you want to keep the child. It's also, is it something for you to get involved in? It's not your family, it's their family. Maybe you should let them take care of it. Weighing all these things and taking the time to do a sort of philosophical inquiry allows you to sort of suss out all these nuanced details, and either, like you said, provide yourself with a little more clarity, at least in terms of, the landscape of the situation, or it actually could lead you to an answer of, actually, all right, maybe I should go with this choice. Maybe I should intervene. Maybe I shouldn't, after sussing out all these details. Right. And I really like that, because philosophical inquiry allows for you to really see the nuance of a situation, whereas opposed to, you just kind of go with the automaticity of everything, and you're just kind of left helpless.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
I'll add that I think one thing that, that kind of setting up a space which is sort of marked as philosophical, where it's like, okay, now we're going here to do some philosophy here. You can talk in, this person had clearly thought about this to a great deal, and I'm sure she talked about it with other people too, but she hadn't talked about it in a space necessarily that was identifiably philosophical. And I think that, telling people that they're having a philosophical conversation, the subject matter might be a subject matter which they broached many times in their everyday life, but if you sort of indicated that, okay, well, we're doing philosophy here, then you kind of have it sort of puts people on their best behavior in a certain way. Like, people become more patient, people become more open-minded, they become more sort of careful to explain themselves and to understand, other moral possibilities or something like that. And I think this doesn't always happen. There are, mean-spirited, narrow-minded, nasty conversations which are like marked as philosophical, but like, at its best, this sort of space for philosophy can kind of nurture or foster sort of norms of discourse and norms of thought that are productive, that can help people. You hope, you keep your fingers crossed, it's hard to know, but that people can sort of take with them into the rest of their lives in some way or other, and that these the habits of mind which you sort of adopt in one space can sort of live with you elsewhere. One hopes. Yeah.
And I think one of the most important aspects of it is the affective component. And so, most of the time when we make decisions, okay, that's not most of the time. Sometimes when we make decisions, we feel guilty about them, and we think, oh my God, how could I have not seen this, right? How did I make decision Y over decision X? And look at sort of the calamity that happened. And I think with a philosophical perspective, if you're speaking with somebody and you're really sort of talking it through, and you're sort of weighing out all of the options and weighing out all the potential risks and benefits, and then making sort of, based on reason, obviously, sort of the best decision that's available to you. I think even if it doesn't go as well as you'd hoped, or even if there is some sort of calamity, look, there's going to probably be some level of guilt, but I think that the level of guilt wouldn't be as intense, because then you can go back and say, look, I really actually just did the best I could. I sat there, with my philosopher, with my therapist or whomever, we talked this out. Maybe we talked about it for hours and we weighed all of the options, and this was the best case scenario for us at the time. So even though things did go poorly and there were some sort of circumstances that for whatever reason I wasn't able to predict, at the very least I can go back and say, look, I honestly did the best I could.
God, I never thought about that, but yeah, you're right. You're right that there, it's one thing to fuck up when you haven't deliberated very carefully in advance. It's another thing where you have, and you can say, well, you know what, I could have done this better, but with the resources I had at the time, this was the best I can do, so I can live with it to that extent. I think that's right.
And then we can even say, I'll blame the philosopher. I spoke to him and he told me the same thing. We both agreed on it. So come on, it's not just my fault.
There you go. Yeah, right. If nothing else, we're just giving an opportunity for all the good people of New York City to blame the local college professors for making plans.
You guys are like the local priest now. Absolve us of our guilt.
Oh, God. Yeah, that's good.
And it's what factors kind of led to, I guess, the writing of the book, right? So how come you thought that writing the book was just sort of this thing that was necessary to take it, obviously, from the locality, from Brooklyn or New York City on the whole, and to kind of bring it to a national stage?
Yeah, I was approached by my editor, Stephen Power, who's then at Thomas Dunn Books. The book was moved to St. Martin's later on for pandemic-related reasons. But I was approached by him, I think after I did a little radio segment, like a Ask a Philosopher call-in with my friend Lee McIntyre. And we just had this one meeting over, coffee or a salad or whatever it was. And we just kind of very quickly, I think, worked out the basic idea of the book. I mean, I had the thought of, oh yeah, I guess I could write something about this at some point, but it had never really occurred. I wasn't thinking straight, I guess. I'd never really thought productively about what the format would be. What would writing about this actually look like? And then, in that conversation with Stephen, I mean, we basically worked out the structure of the thing. It's like, we'd have different types of questions which we'd answer. It would be organized by the type of question. It would be sort of shortish answers to each question, and then little vignettes, little stories sort of sprinkled throughout, the episodes, the encounters that make the booth like interesting. There's the booth is about, the ideas and conversations it generates, but it's also sort of a piece of guerrilla theater, so you get so hopefully the stories kind of give that theatrical sort of sense. But yeah, I gotta say, this is like the easiest thing to write that I've ever written, because it was like, there were, some questions were harder than others, I guess, but because we'd already had all these conversations, I wasn't transcribing the conversations verbatim by any stretch of the imagination, but because, I had already necessarily thought about each of these things, and I had to get my story straight. I had to think harder about some things, think about what would sort of be most useful on the page, but it just came very, very easily to me. It was a lot of fun to write. This was just like, every day for however many months, I'd, pick up one of these questions, and then it's like, okay, that's, if I feel like thinking about this question today, that's what I'm doing today. Yeah.
And that's what I love about public philosophy in general, and just kind of your method in particular, because what made, from a psychotherapeutic standpoint, what made writers like Nerv Yalom super popular is because, I mean, even though he talked about concepts, the sort of crux of his work was not necessarily the ideas. I mean, obviously it was, but the most important part were the relationships that he encountered and the people that he encountered. And so what I think philosophy for the most part, and look, I'm not a philosopher, so I can't say for sure, but what I found it to be lacking was that it's mostly academic, right? It's sort of like we're talking about ideas, and people definitely purport to have the knowledge of or sort of answers, kind of behind the ideas, which is great. And I love that. And I think it definitely has its place, just like, psychology textbooks have their place. But for the most part, I think what actually sort of grips people is literally the sort of encounters, whether it's sort of the philosophical dialogue or whether you're an Irv Yalom and you're writing like Love's Executioner and you're talking about these deep, intimate relationships you have with your clients, and you're both trying to work and sort of resolve like difficult questions in their lives about love and meaning, and sort of like, what am I doing with myself, right? Is this the right person for me? Are these relationships right for me? And so what I think, and I'm going to assume this, what I think your readers like most about your work, or even will like most about your work, is that they'll probably be able to find themselves in it.
Yeah, that's at least my experience with some of the reviews that I've started to read so far, is that several people have just been like, yeah, it's the, I like the book, or yeah, I guess everybody so far has said they like the book at least a little bit. But, for a lot of people, it's like the best part was, these little episodes. It's the encounters. And you don't see that necessarily in, I enjoy reading good, philosophy journal articles. I enjoy the ideas themselves. It's, and I can get a whole lot of enjoyment out of just sort of reasoning through these things sort of in the privacy of my own home, just reading and writing. But a lot of the pleasure of doing philosophy and a lot of the excitement is the interaction with other people. Yeah. Even in academia as much as at the booth. Yeah.
Interesting. And then, so who are some of the thinkers who influenced you?
Well, my deepest love in philosophy, I think, is philosophy of language. And the questions that I come back to the most are philosophy of language questions. And so especially questions about speech acts, about how we communicate, what we do when we talk to each other. Mm-hmm. The thinkers who've influenced me the most in that department are probably Paul Grice, his work on logic and conversation, and what it means for somebody to mean something. More indirectly, J.L. Austin, who's sort of the father of speech act theory, but later speech act theorists like Kent Bach and Mike Harnish. Ruth Millikan is also, I think, like an important figure for me in thinking through speech acts and thinking about what it means for somebody to express themselves in speech. And so in the philosophy of language department, Grice, Austin, Bach, Harnish, Millikan, those are people who've really affected me. I think I'm a bit of a dilettante. I like to think about I'm restless. I like to think about a lot of different topics in philosophy, and I guess outside of philosophy too. So I'm always happy to read. Find new writers in other fields. In social epistemology and ethics and metaethics and philosophy of science, whatever it is. There's just so much good work out there. And one of the things that philosophy, this is the booth does this to some extent, but there are other ways of doing this in public philosophy. But one of the things that I think public philosophy can do is just like the same thing that public physics, that popular science can do, which is just like, there's so much good science out there, and we need to let people know about it, because it's just incredibly fucking interesting, and they don't have an opportunity to find out about it, in the everyday media. And the exact same goes for philosophy. There's just so much interesting stuff out there. And, you know, whatever we can do to, you know, bring people into those conversations, let people know about it. I mean, it's all for the best.
Yeah, and which is why we're so grateful that you came on, because I think for the most part, that's sort of the point of our podcast. I know Alan says it all the time, that essentially is to get these ideas that you wouldn't normally, I mean, obviously outside of an academic setting, that you wouldn't normally hear about or think about, and bring them to a wider platform.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like a nuanced thinking, critical thinking, knowing when you're projecting, for instance, logical fallacies, right, which is very interesting to me from the field of philosophy,
Right.
and biases, cognitive biases,
Right.
as well. It's interesting to know these things about yourself, because then you can catch when you're making a quote unquote mistake,
Mm-hmm.
and that'll affect your interactions with the world and other people.
Right. And all of that is philosophy. Like, even though it's definitely psychology, I mean, you know, kind of going back to CBT, this is all philosophy. All of our concepts are based in philosophy. So,
Yeah. There's, you know, you get a question sometimes as a professional philosopher, like, well, how has, you know, your work in philosophy, you know, changed your life personally? And in some ways, this question is really hard to answer. You sort of struggle to think of particular theories that you know, have sort of, or papers you've read or something that have sort of shaped how you make decisions. And I can think of those, you know, I've got those examples sort of, you know, that I can trot out. But there's a more sort of diffuse way in which just sort of the, you know, habit of taking ideas seriously that you find sort of intuitively very alien or difficult or strange. The habit of you might say reasoning syntactically, you know, seeing, like taking the words on the page and seeing what sorts of consequences play out from them before you think too hard about, you know, exactly what everything means or exactly whether this is true or not. You know, just sort of seeing how, you know, the ideas sort of are logically structured. I think that's a sort of, a habit of mind, or a set of habits of mind, which you just sort of take throughout everyday life, and, you know, you won't necessarily notice their operation, or if you do, it won't be, you know, in any given instance, you know, absolutely, you know, cataclysmic or life-changing or something like that. But it does change your life. Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
All right, Alan, final questions before we go.
Oh yes. If we wanted to find your book, where could we buy it?
So it's available. It's called Ask a Philosopher, Answers to Your Most Important and Most Unexpected Questions. You can find it on Amazon or Barnes & Noble, where a lot of people buy their books. You could also order it from your local bookstore, which would maybe encourage them to keep it in stock, which would be a nice thing.
And Ian, are you on social media anywhere?
I am, yeah. If you want to, people can hit me up on Facebook, I guess, if they want to. You know, my name is Ian Olasov. Well, maybe I should spell my last name, or it'll be in the show notes, I guess. My name is, I like forget how to spell my own last name often enough. But there's also the event series under which I organize all this stuff is called Brooklyn Public Philosophers. And so people can check out the Brooklyn Public Philosophers Facebook page or Tumblr to find out about future talks, about future Ask a Philosopher booths. You know, obviously during the pandemic, a lot of this stuff has been online, but we've been able to do some interesting stuff, and stuff that brings philosophers from all over the world together, which is nice. So yeah, you can check out the Brooklyn Public Philosophers Facebook page.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much for coming on. This was so great.
Yo, thank you. Yeah, this is a blast.
All right, Ian. We'll talk to you soon, man.
Okay, take it easy.
Bye.
That was awesome.
That was really fun.
Right. So if you want to follow us at Seize the Moment Podcast on Facebook and on Instagram, and at Seize_podcast on Twitter. Like, subscribe, Hit the bell.
Hit the bell. And then you can also find us at the O4L Online Network at o4lonlinenetwork.com under the STM podcast section.
All right, guys. Thanks so much for watching, and see you next time.